Welcome to the Reschool'd Podcast, the show that discusses all the things that schools may have missed, with your hosts, AJ Kuti and Jason Gordon. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We are the Reschool'd Podcast, the show that discusses all the things that schools may not have prepared you for, and they probably didn't. As always, I am AJ, and sitting across from me, Jason. Jason, how are you doing today on this lovely morning?
Well, it is lovely, but I'm tired, AJ. I worked hard this weekend. We were talking before the episode started. I did a video recording session, with 3 camera and cuts and stuff, and I've been working on the edits all weekend. So I feel like I've been working. I don't know. How was your weekend?
Mine was filled with reading and reports. More articles and more reports, and like I said, the dissertation started, so working on those too. So,
see, everybody out there listening, doesn't that make you want to go get a doctorate degree?
If you get the opportunity, go jump off a cliff. You'll probably end better. Today, it's interesting because we're talking about that, and like with my dissertation, there's a lot of this when it comes to the dissertation. But in today's episode, we're going to be talking about autonomy. And the importance, how to use it, the strategy behind it, how to essentially use it to improve the possibilities of successes in your college career.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that sound to you?
Excellent. Before we do, everybody, visit Reschool'd.com. That's Reschool with a D, not an ED. Check us out on our social media handles as well. Great thing about the website, though, is you can see all our past episodes together, and you can read some comments about it, show note type stuff. So, yeah. And of course, please, please, please give us those likes and shares and stars and all the good things on your different or preferred podcasting app. So, but if you'll reach out to us, we'll talk about the topics that you want us to talk about in a separate episode. So please do that.
Yeah, we've had some really good listener questions lately that we've actually made into full-on episodes. And we really enjoy those. So please keep them coming.
One thing I've been surprised about, one question will turn into an entire episode.
45 minutes.
Yeah.
Which inevitably, we go into it going, okay, this will be a 30-minute. And inevitably, we get to 45, sometimes even more than that.
Sometimes I wonder whether we're actually answering the question that they want answered within the first 3 minutes, or not answering at all.
It's like to ask a question. It's like a yes or no question, and we just go on this 45-minute rant.
Yeah.
Well, today's quick question, and I kind of have a feeling I know this one because we've alluded to this a couple times, or you have, about your situation. But if you had to grade yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very little and 10 being a whole lot, how much autonomy did you need or did you seek out when you were going into your undergrad or when you were going through your undergrad?
So I didn't need a great deal of autonomy. I liked the environment I was around in high school and things like that. I always had a ton of autonomy in comparison to most kids growing up. And then that translated into, when I went off to college, I had even more autonomy. So I had more than I needed. So that was never an issue for me whatsoever. But by comparison, I would say I needed a 5 and I had a 9.
Yeah.
So that was about it. What about you?
Yeah, I was kind of in the same boat growing up, especially in high school. Like I had a ton of autonomy. I didn't have the curfews. I didn't have the as many rules. It was pretty free flowing. It was and I kind of do this with my kids now too, especially my son who's 18. But I tell him a lot of times, just use your best judgment. I want to give him that autonomy. I will say that my undergrad experience, simply because of the situation I was in, I feel like my undergrad experience was the autonomy in my undergrad experience was capped because the dean of the School of Business was my dad. Mm-hmm. So, there was a limitation with the autonomy because he was the dean. And so it was tougher, but I do feel like I had that. So it was never like, I'm trying to get out of high school going into college to seek the autonomy because I needed the autonomy because I already had it. I didn't, I honestly, I didn't know anything different behind it other than like I felt the reverbs of friends who didn't have a whole lot of autonomy because they couldn't do things. And so we couldn't get together on certain nights or we couldn't do certain things. But I never not had it. Shoot, that was bad grammar right there. I was never lacking in the autonomy, put it that way. And so, I mean, I came out of high school with probably an 8, and I stayed in college with probably an 8. Well, I'd probably say 6 or 7, because there was a certain things when it came to grade specifically, like my grades, that was the breaking point for my autonomy. Like that was, my parents wanted, because they knew they knew what I could do, and they also knew what I wanted to do with my career, and they knew how important it was. So they stayed on me pretty heavily on that. But assuming I had that, I had almost full autonomy.
Yeah. I've noticed, you talk about your dad all the time, and you're still really, really close with them. Lots of students, you see them fleeing, right?
Yeah.
They're fleeing the nest to try to gain some of that autonomy. They go to a college in a different state. They're trying to establish something that doesn't exist. It seems like largely for people who have a lot of autonomy early on, you don't see as much of that.
Oh, yeah,
right?
of course.
You don't see them going to the other side of the country for college.
You can get into tons of examples of this, because like for me in high school, and this is more of a hypothetical, but in high school, hypothetically speaking,
we'll call this guy J.A.
Yeah, Jay. I had a buddy of mine, but he, all of the students in his class, they would go out partying and drinking because it was this thrill of getting caught. Their parents didn't want them to do it. Their parents most of them were naive to say that they didn't do it, and they didn't want to believe that they did it. And they would go out and they would get drunk. But he had the autonomy. Like his parents never. There was 2 rules: is if you drank, then you either called them to come pick you up, or you stayed where you were at. Now, granted, if those rules were broken, he would be dead meat. But it took away that I guess you would say the thrill of getting caught. Like he didn't do that very often. So yeah, I do think when you are given a certain level of autonomy, you tend to not have that yearn to go off on your own, because you already experienced in some capacity. And then the bills start kicking in, and they suck.
Yes, they do. Yeah, that is a level of autonomy that comes with. Everyone thinks of autonomy as just your parents don't tell you what to do or control whatever is going on in your life. They don't think about the side of it that's, oh crap, now I have to manage paying the rent, paying the power bill, paying the phone bill, paying everything that comes into it, car insurance, everything. That's the everything's got negatives, right?
Yeah,
negative side.
All right, well, let's get into the main question.
Okay.
And the main question, our first one, is we've said this word so many times, and there's probably some listeners out there going, what the heck do we mean? And they probably can infer it based on context clues, but what do we mean when we say the word autonomy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we definitely need to define this up front. So if you didn't pick it up from our intro, basically what we're talking about is obviously parents raise their children, right? Regardless of the scenario you grow up under. 2 parents, 1 parent, grandparents, foster parents, whatever. You have caretakers who are primarily charged with your upbringing. Well, they not only legally have an obligation to take care of you, and in that, there's a level of power inferred there, right? They can make decisions on your behalf. And they can limit you from doing things, right? But also there's the extent to which the things that otherwise don't relate just to health, welfare, benefits, feeding, that type of thing. There's the extent to which your parents are controlling over your life, right? And by necessity, parents have to exercise a level of control over your life. And that historically has diminished the older you get, right? As you approach adulthood, and legally the adulthood mark is somewhere around 18 years old. Well, I would say society in the United States, we've traditionally been on the younger side of that model, right? And perhaps your Latin American countries are on the other end of that model, right? Kids remain kids in the household a lot longer. I would say there's lots of cultures around the world where that's true. There's just an autonomy point. And U.S. has always been pretty early on that scale. So lots of times the marker for many students, right, is you graduate high school and that's it. You're on your own. You're independent. Probably the middle upper class, you end up getting less autonomy than, say, the lower socioeconomic classes that, you hit 18, you're on your own, right? You get a handshake and you're out the door, go make it in this world where when you take on that extra educational role, you're not making as much income as you need to support yourself. Your parents were probably still highly involved in your education early on, so they probably have some level of involvement in your post-high school education. Maybe they're helping you pay for college. Maybe they're supporting you, giving you a place to live. Maybe they're still helping you out with the other things like rent or stuff like that. And, all of this is a question of degree. Everybody's got a different degree there. So that's what we're talking about. Not just the level of strict, you can do this and you can't. It's more about the level of involvement that your parents have in your life, because to the extent there's still some decision-making authority, to the extent there's still some level of control and ability to control, that, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, right, by choice or not, the parent is exercising that control in a way that diminishes your autonomy, right? And we started off the example of you could be super autonomous in high school and go out and drink, right? But parents still support you, right? They still provide the food for the table, the roof over your head, that type of thing. So there's not that much autonomy for a high school student by and large, right? There's maybe a ton of social autonomy and stuff like that. So we're using the word autonomy in a much broader sense. How much control, how much influence did your parents exercise over you? Either them pushing it or you pulling it, one of the two. And so there you go. That's our definition there. You want to add anything to that, AJ?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I guess you would say that the technical definition based on Mr. Webster and Mr. Marion is they say it's the quality or state of being self-governing. And to your point, like I think there is a part of me feels like there's a misconception of or misunderstanding of autonomy being completely on yourself. Because, granted, it says self-governing. But I also think that there's a level of autonomy where you are making the decisions. That doesn't mean you have nobody to rely on, nobody to ask questions of, nobody to get their suggestions of. And I think that's a big difference because, like I said, I had full autonomy, but I valued my parents' thoughts and what their advice was because they've been through it. And so I would, even though I had more or less, like I said, almost full autonomy, I would still go back to them and ask them what their thoughts were on something.
So you weren't a terribly high autonomy need person. Like it wasn't something that you felt like you were constantly fighting to, hey, get out of my life, let me run my own life.
Not even a little. There were times where, I would have that very short term, like week, because I got grounded for doing something stupid. And I was like, man, I wish I didn't have to worry about this. But then immediately I would look back and go, I came out of the other side better because I learned something from it.
Well, the culture, your dad's side of the family anyway, my limited experience with Middle Eastern culture, they tend to be extremely family, homogenous group, your life type oriented, right? That's completely different from the United States.
My uncles,
culture.
Both my uncles and their wives and their whole families live together in a single house.
Yeah.
They stay together.
And, that's not something we see in the U.S. a lot, right?
No,
that's more of a Middle Eastern thing. Sometimes, I suppose sometimes Latin American type
But
thing.
I do, it's interesting you say that, because I do think that, at least in the U.S. side, I think a lot of that dynamic has to do with the autonomy that you have growing up. Because, my kids, my kids are not, we're not raising them in Middle Eastern cultures. I mean, we weren't raised in Middle Eastern cultures, but, we saw it. We have family over there. And I've been over there once, but like, we're not raising our kids that way, but we are raising them more like I am, like I was raised, versus how my wife was raised. We give them more autonomy. Like I said, my 18-year-old son will come to me and say, "Hey, can I do this?" And I usually tell him, use your best judgment. Understand what the costs and the benefits are going to be, and if you can live with the costs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be financial. It could be, repercussions or whatever. If you can live with that to get those benefits and you're happy with that, then fine, go for it. But if you really truly don't understand the costs of it and what could happen, then the benefits may not be as beneficial as you think they are.
Oh, yeah. And I would say it's a sliding scale for the type of person and the environment you're around. You and I think, are probably on opposite ends of the spectrum there. You come from a culture, your dad, well, let's start with the family dynamic, right? Your dad comes from a culture where it's very, families continue to live together right on their entire lives. My dad left home at 16 years old, right? I mean, he lived with friends, he lived on top of a cattle barn, he lived with a cousin, just after 16. And my mom, she graduated high school. She had just turned 18, and, she was on her own. And you still have your parents to go back and talk to and stuff. My dad, not so much. My grandparents have kind of moved off a bit. But, it's hearty handshake and you're out the door. Go make a life, go support yourself, go pay your bills, go do whatever you're going to do with your life. And you're just another adult at that point in time. There's no control anymore. There's actually zero control anymore, right? It's just you're dealing with another human. Where I studied abroad in Hispanic countries, a couple of them, and I noticed a complete different, dynamic, right? It's not like that. You are kind of a member of a family almost always, right? Men get a little more autonomy early on, but you really don't break away, and you're not subject to your parents' rules, or your parents you're never the head of the household. You're still part of that dynamic all the way until you marry, right? And then, actually sometimes not even then, because like if you've ever watched Encanto, right? The husband and wives move back into the household, and the oldest family member is still the controlling force there, right? And in the U.S. we're not like that hardly at all, by and large, right? We still have that old Protestant, type thing going. But you have so many cultural influences in the U.S., particularly Hispanic being number one, right? At 14% of the population, you start to see this melding of cultures together when it comes to the family dynamic and things like that. So it's really interesting. So I'd say in the college environment, when you have such a melting pot now with so many groups, so many people from different socioeconomic classes, right? Because traditionally the lower socioeconomic class has been the ones with the highest level of autonomy earlier, right? You leave home at 16, 17, where if you were a more well-to-do family, you're maybe not on your own till you're in your 20s, type thing. And, in some scenarios, you're never really on your own, right? Your parents exercise control over your life forever, right?
Yeah, that was the point I was actually going to bring up. Is with my family, we're raising them, and what would be an American, I guess you would say American style versus the Middle Eastern style. But we give them that autonomy. My son, and you can ask him right now, jokingly, I ask him, pretty regularly, when are you moving out? Because he's 18. I mean, I don't expect him to, and I don't want him to. But he always tells me he's not moving out until at least he's 28. maybe 30. And we have
but that's a new trend among the population
that is true,
in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
I mean, but that's an example of our culture shifting, right?
Yep.
Young adults are staying at home longer, and while they have autonomy over their lives, by and large, they're still subject to a framework of a provider, right?
House rules.
And yeah, it's your house, right?
Yep.
It's your money that's putting food on the table primarily. Yep. You're probably paying for the car insurance, I would guess.
And everything else.
Perhaps even the phone, right?
Yep.
And, that's not usually at 18, historically at 18, that cut off. Yep. Unless you were upper crust, which usually was only the upper crust that got to go to college, right? And parents, even the tax laws, right? Yep. This well, made special provision for families who said, well, we're going to send our kids to extended education, and would allow them to be a dependent for purposes of tax status. Even the more recent healthcare law has embraced that, right? The ability to keep your kids on your health insurance until you're 26 years old if they're enrolled in an institution of higher education. All of that just embraces this culture shift we've seen where the level of autonomy comes about at a later age.
Yeah.
I would say so. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would agree. Second question, and maybe since we've talked about what it is, what are some scenarios when issues from lacking autonomy and also having absolute autonomy could arise?
Well, okay, so
let's start with lacking. What are some issues with lacking autonomy?
Okay, so and I'm probably a decent person to talk on this because I had a ton of autonomy, right? It was kind of a mixed bag with me. I didn't need as much autonomy. I embraced the structure of my parents being in control a little bit more. But when I went to college, I saw my parents when I went home for holidays. They over a 4-year period when I was in college, they came to that college town I was in twice, right, or maybe 3 times over a 4-year period, and so if I were to see them, and I would call home every couple of weeks, or at least every month, and talk to them, right? Really, never my dad. I just talked to my mom, But so by most standards, I had a good bit of autonomy, right? More than I needed. My wife, as the far extreme, had a parent, particular mother, who, was involved in literally everything. Had to know her teachers, had to know her assignments, had to talk to her every day, sometimes a couple hours any given day, every day maybe, right? So it was a high level of connection, a high level of involvement. And she actually, I would say, wanted more or needed more autonomy than she got, right? So with me, sometimes I felt a little lost, on one end, like I was swimming upstream, not knowing 100% exactly what I had to accomplish. Because, I think my only goal set by the parents was, we want you to graduate from college. And, so that was the only thing I had to focus on, right? They never knew anything about grades or anything like that. So that wasn't a pressure or anything coming from them. But you take the opposite end of the spectrum. What happens when you have parents who are they need to know your assignments. They need to know your teachers. And if you don't make the grade that they expect, then all of a sudden there's repercussions, right? There's disappointment or some level of, or gosh, I've had parents as a professor that contacted me on behalf of the student. And that's probably the most extreme level, right? Where parents are that involved. Well, that level of involvement diminishes the growth of the individual, because they lack the autonomy that they need to experience things and handle things on their own. And I would say that is where it becomes terribly negative, right?
Yeah.
Because it inhibits individual personal development.
Yeah, I would agree because my mind goes back to, okay, if you always have that, especially in school and the grades and stuff like that, you always have that helicopter parent who is pushing you so hard. One, it starts to present this fear. It starts to create this fear of failure because of the punishment that's coming, and which then in turn can have a negative effect on your ability to be creative and imaginative, because that doesn't really coincide with typically the objective side of exams and assignments and stuff. And my mind always goes back, and it's the person that says that the quote came from, the person who said it. There's argument as to, did this person actually say it? Did Albert Einstein actually say this quote? But he's probably the most commonly one that it is attributed to. But that whole thing, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you'll live your whole life thinking it's stupid.
Yes.
And
very, very famous one.
Yeah, and I to me, I kind of feel like that when it comes to, if you have this lack of autonomy where you everybody's making the decisions for you, how are you ever going to know? How are you ever going to grow? And I'm a believer of making mistakes. Like, making mistakes and failure is failure is not an outcome; it's part of the process. And I usually tell students, like, you're young, make mistakes early and often, because at least it lets you know you're trying. But when you have somebody who is that helicopter parent who is so engrossed in making the decisions for you and making sure that you're on the right path, then you never really get to understand what failure is. Because I guess at least in my head too, like, even talking about this with you now, but to me, if I was in that situation, I would almost attribute the failure to my parents, because they were the ones that made the decision.
Yeah. I mean, I saw that all the time, right? And there's this, at the same time, this inability to recognize, or unwillingness to recognize, the failures of the parent and the student when things didn't go right. It was always somebody else's fault.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
It's always someone else contributed to it type scenario, rather than a recognition of, well, no, I mean, sometimes you just don't perform quite as well, or you didn't do what you were supposed to, or whatever. And yes, it's,
I actually think
it is a result of effort or lack of effort, right?
Do you feel like that's the reason why college has gotten to the way it is right now, is because of the lack of autonomy? Because, I mean, how many times have you heard students, I've asked students many times, so why are you in college? And the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, well, my parents made me.
So, college is weird like that. There's this expectation now, like, society has created this pressure that if you don't go to college, then you're not going to be professionally successful, which we know is not true. But there's this perception there that you need that. And so lots of times I think either parents were not as involved as they could have been early on, like in high school education, and then they want to become highly involved in this secondary process, or the exact reverse. They were so involved in the high school portion of it, and then they're like, okay, we got you into college now.
Yeah.
Just do the right thing. And then, you find students who are just like, well, I don't have somebody forcing me to do my homework. I don't have somebody checking on my grades the same way. I don't have someone making certain I don't go out and party and make sure I'm actually in bed at a decent hour to get to school the next day. And then they go downhill, right? They don't perform as well. And, I think that's the balance, right? You and I talked about autonomy in terms of, like, parental control, in terms of being able to do the things we wanted to do. And we had that. At least, I can't speak for you, I had a massive amount of self-discipline for accomplishing the expectations of college, right? Going to college and doing my work, doing the reading, getting good grades and things like that. I didn't need that from my parents at all. But in high school, all the way through, I had so little influence from them. Like, they did not force me to make good grades. They did not force me to study. They did not force me to do any of those things. They encouraged it, but they never forced it. And there was a time in middle school when I was making really bad grades. And, they expressed their disappointment and things like that, but still there was never force. And I think that level of autonomy, even in the extent to which I focused on my academic work, made me self-responsible during my high school years. So when I went to college, that extreme level of autonomy that I had, basically I was on my own, I then had the self-ingrained from high school motivation to do well. And I made all A's almost all the way. I made a couple of B's, but I made very good grades all the way through college, and I worked really, really hard at it. But that was all self-motivated. I can remember, I think it was my sophomore year before I remember speaking to my dad at one point, and it was sophomore year, and this was the first time, maybe the only time I ever got asked about grades. He said, "Well, are you passing your classes and everything?" I said, "I sure am." That was the only question that ever came.
Yeah.
And, that was, like I say, that's probably a more extreme level of autonomy than most people are used to. But it worked for me. And it worked based upon the high level of autonomy they gave me early on. And it wasn't just, like I say, that simple, you can do what you want autonomy. There was always an urging there to do well, to do as well as you can. But there was no force. I've almost never felt forced at anything other than showing respect. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Right. You don't talk back to your mama.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you value your life, you don't talk back to your parents. Right.
She brought you in. She could bring you out.
Yeah. There was that level of, you show respect to your elders and stuff like that. That was forced. Not doing anything wrong, not drinking and driving, not stealing something, that was forced, right?
Yeah.
They were very anti-drug use type things, that type of thing. That was definitely forced.
Yeah.
But everything else was almost complete autonomy.
To the other side of the question, when we talk about having absolute autonomy and the issues that could arise from that, like part of what you were just talking about, this came up because I was actually going to speak on this, is I think the biggest issue that could rise from having absolute autonomy really stems from maturity. Like we're talking about 18-year-olds, which granted in the eye of the law, that is a legal adult, but there's plenty of studies out there that say that, the maturity level has not got to its peak or anywhere close to its peak. If I had to guess, because you said you were raised on a farm, I would venture to say, just based on my very limited knowledge of, friends that grew up on a farm, that you were raised from a young age to take part in farm chores, farm duties. You woke up, you did certain things. That created this.
Just to give you a little insight in that, I had to wake up at 6 a.m. to feed the cows before going to school.
Yeah. So to me, that to me is like, they're seeing maturity in you earlier than in my family. Like we didn't have that. We didn't have the daily chores. We had things that we were supposed to do. But we didn't have those kind of things. And I played sports all my life. So I was usually at practice or games. And if I wasn't doing that, I was either playing some kind of video game when I was younger or playing with some friends. But they didn't see, I'm sure, probably even to this day, they didn't see the maturity that maybe your parents have. And that's why I had a little bit more focus from them. So the lack of autonomy from them when it comes to certain things that were important, that they knew it was going to be important, like grades. Mine wasn't to the micro level of checking my grades for every assignment or every exam or even midterms. They were kind of more on they weren't quite as macro as yours, where you're just saying, are you passing? But they were like, how are your grades at the end of the semester? Because they knew a lot of things could change between the midterms and I was notorious for poor midterms and good, final grades. So they really cared about the final grades. They didn't helicopter over me for every individual assignment or anything like that. But they did know that I needed that I guess you would say structure from them, that push from them to try to do my best. And if I didn't, then I would have some kind of punishment put on me for not getting to the standards that they felt I could, which again, looking back, I could have. So I think maturity is a big issue.
And, one thing there, everything applies, subjectively, right? We can talk about this stuff objectively, just how it applies to everybody. But really, people need different things, right?
Of course.
People have different personalities. Kids have different personalities and need more or less autonomy, the extent to which parents are able to give it, right? I mean, I had never, and still to date, I've never seen a relationship with as little autonomy as my wife and her brother, particularly probably her brother, had. Right? I mean, all the way through grad school, right? You still sent his assignments to his mom to look over right before turning it in. Like
Dang.
it was just the most extreme.
Yeah.
But perhaps he needed that, right?
Yeah. That's funny, yeah.
And maybe it was because she's has that high need to be involved, right? And maybe that carried over from a young age with her, and she's just wanting to. Where with my parents, maybe they had so much autonomy, they showed certainly more control, I would say, over me and more involvement. Like my mom was so highly involved in helping me with all the things like arranging for financial aid for college, because they were co-signers on any loans I needed to get. They bought me a car in high school before going to college, and they kept it under their names.
Sure. As did mine.
And paid the insurance all the way through college, and I was able to pay for my gas, and I was able to pay for my rent because, I waited tables and things like that. I was able to pay for I didn't get a cell phone until I was probably a sophomore. But, I didn't have a ton of expenses. I was able to buy myself a computer and stuff like that. So, it was a good balance. Like they helped me in the ways I needed help.
Yep.
In ways that they didn't have. So, to an extent, offering any level of financial assistance is, in a way, yes, you're shackling someone to your support, right?
Sure,
so, right, it's that, just like nations, right? It's that curse of the, abundant natural resource, curse of wealth, where all of a sudden you become tied to that type thing. But, in my situation, it was just the perfect balance, right? It never caused any issues with me. It actually just promoted my drive to achieve expectations that I'd set for myself, rather than my drive to achieve expectations set by somebody else. So with me, I was just lucky. It worked. My parents, I'd say, did it well for my personality type. But I could have been a different personality type, and it might not have lined up well. I think it didn't line up well for my wife because she's more autonomous, and that extreme level of involvement in control didn't work as well for her. But I think it worked a little better for maybe her brother, who was less independent, less autonomous, less competent early on. It took a lot longer to mature, right? That type of thing.
Well, really quickly, last question, because this is a strategies episode. So, what's your advice to students on how to deal with the autonomy dynamic? Like, what are some strategic advices that you can give?
It's, once again, I think you have to start with yourself and say, what level of autonomy do I need? Am I going to be self-motivated for my own best interest? And, if you can recognize fully where you are, because at 18, you are an adult, whether whoever likes it or not, whether you
By
recognize it or
law, you're
not,
an adult.
you can do anything you want. You can file your own taxes. You can cut ties with your parents. You can go do whatever you want to in this world. There's no one can stop you at that point outside of the law, right? But with that being said, most people don't live under that regime, right? So there's these social ties, social bonds, and they're going to exist. And so you have to examine yourself and say, how much do I need? And then you have to work to establish that level of relationship, because oftentimes you can't depend upon other people, your parents, even though they know you so well. You can't depend upon them to recognize the level of control or autonomy you need. So in a way, you have to be the one that sets the boundaries, or you have to be the one to ask for additional help and support, and recognize that they are going to have failings. They're going to have scenarios where they don't supply the amount of support that you need, whether it's financial or emotional or whatever. And then there's going to be scenarios where you just need to tell them, like, look, it's my life. Leave me alone. Get out of it. I don't care if you pay my bills, great, but that doesn't allow you to be in that level of social and emotional control over my life, because dependency breeds dependency, right? To the extent that you don't have something, it means that even no matter how bad you want it, right, you become your own barrier. You can't have it because you don't know how to achieve it, right? So once again, everything, it has to be obviously respectful, but there has to be mutual understanding on both sides. And
Yeah.
maybe I'm not the best to talk about this, right? Because I was so lucky. I had the perfect degree of autonomy for me. My parents were just amazing in that way. Some people would say my parents were too hands off, but they recognized in me that I needed that amount, that I didn't need more, and I was self-motivated, right? And there you go, right? So once again, it's a back and forth between the parents, but you have to start by recognizing how much you need and starting to communicate that to the other side. That's my only tip, right? That's the only one I got.
I will second the self kind of soul searching to understand what you need. I think that's probably the biggest one, because again, you're right. Everybody's different. And I'm in the same boat as you are. My parents I was fortunate enough that my parents were good enough to see what I needed, and they gave me that. So I'm in that same boat. I've talked to a bunch of students, because I do, I lead small groups of students, and some of them, I talk to them at my church, and I would say, if I had to give advice from the parent dynamic of autonomy, one of the things I typically tell them is, it's one word, and it's grace. Practice giving grace. Understand that, especially like my mom always told me, I was the firstborn. So my mom always told me, we didn't come out with manuals. Like, we didn't how-to manuals, how to parent manuals. It's a trial and error thing. And sometimes they failed at what they were trying to do, and sometimes they succeeded. And if you can look back, and granted, if you're 18, you have, comparative to what you will hopefully become, 18 years of your life is a small percentage. But one day you'll be able to look back at your life and see the whole picture, not just those little pieces that just irked you to no end. It didn't make any sense to you right then. But like I tell my students, parents are doing the best they can in their head. You may not agree with them. And there's, like I said, a lot of things that they may fail on. But the communication is important. And like I said, giving grace is important with that understanding. I didn't agree with everything my parents did, but the vast majority of it I deeply, deeply appreciate because, I mean, I'm not the person. I wouldn't be the person I am today without the way I grew up. And my kids should be very, very happy because I'm doing it the same way they did it. And I'm sure your kids are going to be very happy with the way that you're doing it because it's the way that you brought up, and you can see how your parents was able to identify what your individual kids needed, and give them the same support, whether it be, higher levels of autonomy or lower levels of autonomy based on their personality. So that would be my advice, is when it comes to the parent side of it, just practice a little bit of grace. It sucks. I'm not saying be happy all the time, but just, work on the understanding, because that will make things a little bit easier as you go forward. And that communication and that relationship is what drives, at least in my opinion, the autonomy. I told my son this, or my wife, both of us told him, the more you show us that you can handle the autonomy and you do it with, good judgment, the more you'll get it. We have,
if you have to come up with this scenario once you're past the point of, well, you don't have any power over me anymore, right? If you wait that late in the game, that is, I can support myself, you truly have no power over me. I can get my own place. I can do all these things. So then it's almost too late, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The tracks are laid.
My son right now still, he's 18. He has, now granted, we bought the truck, but I mean, it's in our name, but it's, for all intents and purposes, it's his truck. But he'll go to places, and at 16, we would ask him, if you're going to go somewhere, just let us know where you're moving, so we know if something were to go wrong or whatever, we can come get you, and let us know that you got there okay. Because 16, you're the first time driving, and even to this day, he still does it. He still, and it was one of those things we told him: if you give us the communication, we'll let you do what you want to do within reason, because you've never given us reason not to. We trust him. And so, like I said, even to this day, he's 18 and he still does it and still has no problem doing it. And it's just, hey, I'm here, or hey, I'm going here. And it's like, okay, thanks for letting me know.
And that meets his need, his level of comfort. And it, like I say, so it sounds like, I can't speak on his part, obviously, but from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a mutual both ways there understanding, where there's not a lot of frustration, where extremes can cause frustration. So you lay out the expectations early, and there you go.
Yep. Well, that was a good episode. 47 minutes. 30 minutes we thought. 47 is not bad. You got any parting words before we head out?
No. Except for to say, one, this was great. I think we should do more parent-student dynamic.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Yeah.
So we'll do more of that. But yeah, and then just to remind everybody, please hit us up on the website. Please send us communications about what you want to hear. Please give us the likes on your social media app of choice. And then, that's it. We'll try to tailor these shows to what you want to hear.
Absolutely. Well, we hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope to see you next time. Until then, goodbye.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Reschool'd Podcast. Be sure to head over to reschool'd.com for news and other information on things we're getting into.